Renaissance in Italy. So the Renaissance has been defined in different ways as a revival or a renewal, right? And so the question then is, how did this revival happen and how did this renewal happen? Well, there's a couple reasons that it did happen, which is one, the sacking of Constantinople, right? So when the Byzantine empire was overthrown by the Ottomans, a lot of like scholars from the Byzantine world came and actually hid out in Italy and brought with them a lot of wealth of knowledge. Also, the subsequent crusades also led to increased trade routes and the bringing of ideas from the Muslim world. And after the Ottoman Empire was established, the Ottoman Empire became one of the most powerful trading partners in the world. And Italy, being so close, just right across the Mediterranean from them, established themselves as an important trading port, right? As a place to do banking and a stop along that route for Europe to trade with the Islamic world. And for years, Italy had been trading with the Islamic world and getting ideas from them, and they've been heavily influencing the scientific revolution and other things. Also, the reduction of church power, right, as trade and merchants rose up as kind of a member of the upper class and as ruling classes of people asserted themselves throughout Europe. It challenged the supremacy of the church power, right? And of course, last but not least, the printing press, which helped disseminate ideas, which of course, movable type and things like that, borrowed heavily from Chinese technologies, which were all influenced by, trade along the Silk Road, and then of course trade with the Islamic world. So why Italy, right? Well, if you look at Italy at the time, Italy was not a unified kingdom. It was several like little republics, I guess, set up, kind of run by one major city, right? So like the Kingdom of Naples had Naples, right? Sicily had Palmero and Syracuse, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the most important ports, though, within the various kingdoms of Italy was Florence, which we're going to talk about. So it was a crossroad of trade, like they did a lot of trade with the materials that they had, but predominantly Italy really added value as a port where they could establish banking and a merchant class of people who would trade, right? Particularly like pepper and spices coming out of the Ottoman Empire, et cetera, et cetera. And so because of their situation in the merchant class that was developed within places like Florence, a lot of these bankers and merchants got absurdly rich. And one of the things that you do when you have a lot of money is you like to make public shows of donations, of public support, because it provides you with recognition. And it also like adds value to your place in society, says you're an important person in society. Look at billionaires today, right? Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, they might donate to charity because they might have like a need or they might want to be good people. But at the same time, too, it also legitimizes their wealth and legitimizes their power and access to people who have power, right? So that's a big part of it, right? And then, of course, Italy was also the center of the classical world. So, of course, the Roman Empire was established within the confines of these republics, right? And so they had the architecture and the Catholicism that kind of helped fuel the initial push of the Italian Renaissance. So, right, like the Catholic Church had enormous power, enormous wealth, and people wanting to curry favor with the church. For example, the Medici family would buy things for both their city, but also for the church, right? And they'd commission these artists to do famous works like paintings and sculptures, etc., right? And right away, you can see one of the tensions forming over the individual versus the collective, right? So the wealth and power of the church and the community versus, a rich secular person, right? And for the Medicis, eventually, although they were, dukes and merchants, eventually some of the Medicis rose up to be popes, and four popes became Medicis. Four Medicis became popes. So, basically, like the city state was set up, and each of these families in Italy, right? So during this time, there's a lot of turmoil in Florence and in different places. There was, different governments changing, and governments led by guilds, and governments led by this group, and they were constantly changing, and there was, all these different things going on. But at the center of who really had the power tended to be these wealthy, powerful merchant families, right? And you can see some images of them up there, right? Florence particularly represents the brilliance of the Renaissance. Not brilliance as in like, oh, how brilliant it is, but basically how this whole system plays out and how this whole system works, right? So the Medici is the wealthy family that controls Florence. Cosimo de Medici gained control in 1434 and uncrowned rulers. So basically, in the beginning, it started off just like this one wealthy, powerful guy, but he had the power to like change government by paying people off, by things that we'd consider corruption. But back in the days, that was just the way that sausage got made, right? So he was a patron of the arts. He was a financial supporter. He said, "Hey, I want to have this Duomo build, or I need to have, I want to have this painting done for Florence, or I want to have this sculpture in Florence, or I want to have it done for the Catholic Church." He would finance these things, right? And this trade, this wealth came from Florence being a global banking center connected to the spice trade, right? And so, really the birthplace of like almost global financiers or international banking, modern capitalism almost come from this idea, right? Other cultures and other different things, other Muslim groups had banking set up, but this was like an interfaith, intercountry, everything, global banking center, right? And money, of course, turns into power, like I said. Eventually, the Medicis would lose their money and they'd lose some of their power, but they would regain it, right? And they would become popes and royalty, right? Catherine Medici became Queen of France, so meant a lot of things, right? So, involved in the ideas of the Renaissance is constantly this tension between like the betterment of the individual and also like the power that is still being controlled by the Catholic Church and by a few wealthy few, right? So, there's this guy named Petrarch, right, who was not happy with the current state of society, right? So stop me if you've heard this before, but a guy who says, you know what, the way that we live now is not good. We need to think back and go back to the old times when people used to think this way, right? We need to make our culture superior again or greater again, right? And so Petrarch founded this idea, at least in Italy. It wasn't new other places, but this idea of the importance of a person to study humanities, not just to study religious texts, but to study things like grammar, rhetoric, poetry, and history. And he looked not globally, really, but really to the classics of Greece and Rome, right? And back then, there was kind of, before this, there was a de-emphasis on studying anything Greco or Roman because the only study you needed to do was of the church, right? Of church texts and of important church conversations, right? And so Petrarch, right, who is a Florentine from Florence, he popularized the idea that there was a dark or age that needed to be gotten rid of, right? That the medieval ages was the dark ages, and that those ideas were bad and retrograde, and we needed to go back and look at these old ideas, right? And including in those was ideas of scholarship and poetry and things of that, right? And establishing libraries of works and emphasize secular art and study, even though he himself was a man of faith connected to the Catholic Church. Okay, now art also reflected this humanism, right? It reflected this idea of perfection and then this idea of needing to better yourself as a person through study or through demonstration, right? And so with this art, you see a lot of different things that are going on. You see religious themes, but you also see some secularism where there's connections to like ancient Greco-Roman ideas. And then well-known figures are well represented in art to reflect individual achievement, right? To represent an archetype that we can strive to be, right? And of course, a certain element of realism, right? And we'll talk a little about this because bodies were also highly idealized, right? But there's also a realistic dimension, and these people looked human-like, right? So in order to show you what I mean by that realism, I need to show you some medieval art that is not realistic, right? And so you can see with all these different demonstrations, right here, we have a version of the Pieta, right, which means pity, right? This is actually a wood carving that was done in what would be present-day Germany. Here's a drawing of a lion, which doesn't really look like a lion. Here is from a manuscript of a knight fighting a slug. And to this day, we have no idea what this is about. And it appears that I really can't even speculate. Then, of course, we have Mary and Jesus up in the corner here. We have Jesus, who is a baby, but also just appears to be just a small adult. And then we, of course, have these people in ships, which is totally, not represented by perspective or anything like that. It's very two-dimensional. And of course, what art is doing here is it's telling you just a story and not really worrying about what else is going on, right? That there's something happening in these images, right? It's not really worrying about the perspective of, if you look at the way that the bodies are in this art, you say, well, that's not really representative of how human bodies are shaped, right? But nonetheless can be powerful. Right now, with the Renaissance in Italy, there was a focus on, instead of making things two-dimensional, like a lot of these images are, to focus on depth and providing depth, right? So they did that by providing perspective, right? Three-dimensional art that creates depth by having a vanishing point. One of the things you learn about art, here's an image right here of the School of Athens done by Raphael. And as you can see, your eyes, there's a balance to the picture, and there's all these like shapes, but those vanishing points directly to the center, where in the middle you have Plato and Aristotle arguing about the nature of things, and arguing about the nature of the world, right? And more a little bit on that. But basically, a lot of these people too, like Leonardo and Michelangelo, in order to understand human anatomy, they cut up cadavers to learn about how the body works so that they could make their art more realistic of a human form. Now, let's talk about some of the Renaissance people that you guys know. Everyone knows the Ninja Turtles. I'm going to talk about three of them. I won't talk about Donatello. It's not because I don't like Donatello. In fact, I like Donatello's bronze version of the David actually better than Michelangelo's personally, as a personal opinion. But anyhow, I'll continue. So Leonardo da Vinci did a lot of different things in his paintings, right? Is he dealt a lot with ideas of perspective and vanishing point, like in the idea of the Last Supper, right? And also, this is a picture of it pre-restored. You can see better images of it, of what it actually looks like. But you can see that there are these equal like boxes going down the picture and drawing your eyes to the vanishing point, which in the middle, in the center, everyone is balanced around Jesus in the center, right? And this is supposed to be after he reveals to his apostles that someone will betray him, right? And you can see these people like looking at each other, pointing, and they're demonstrating some sort of emotion and trying to figure out. And you can kind of feel the frantic panic as you see the calm of Jesus. Now, there's a lot of people have talked about this painting, but you can see that there's boxes up ahead, there's boxes here, and that obviously nobody would ever sit around a dinner table like that. But the whole idea is to create some sort of balance and to focus your eyes upon the calmness and the stillness and the acceptance of Jesus, that somebody will betray him, right? And you can look more into who these all represent later, right? Now, the Mona Lisa is interesting too, because the Mona Lisa is not a religious figure at all, right? A lot of times these have religious themes. This is a secular theme, just some random person that lived at the time, right? Now, she has a wry smile, and in the background there is a landscape, right? Now, the landscape doesn't really look very realistic, but it's a focus on putting the human being in nature, right? And also, this human being is an everyday person, and if you notice, the Mona Lisa doesn't have any eyebrows. That's because back in the day, it was a style for women to shave their eyebrows, I believe in Florence and a lot of other city-states in Italy, right? But Leonardo da Vinci was an archetype of what they used to call the Renaissance man. We're going to call the Renaissance person, because you can be a Renaissance person. You don't have to have a gender associated with being a person of the Renaissance. So this phrase, Renaissance man or Renaissance person, is someone with broad achievement with many talent in many areas. So, for example, Leonardo da Vinci did things with math, anatomy studies, the Vitruvian Man, the flying machine, and he was interested in classics. He had adventurous spirit and emphasized a lot of different things. And so people who are good at a lot of different things, they tend to be seen as Renaissance men. For example, Dwayne the Rock Johnson, right, is a guy you can like sing a little. He can be in, he can provide his voice for cartoon work. He can be a professional wrestler. He used to be, he probably could have been a college football. He was a college football player. Probably been a pro football player if he didn't get hurt. Like he's a guy who has a lot of different skills, and I think it's an archetype of a Renaissance man today, right? The other one is Michelangelo, right? Michelangelo was a sculptor, engineer, painter, architect, and poet. Now, the first thing I want to tell you guys that we forget to realize is that in neoclassical sculptures, we often see this marble that's like unscathed marble, very smooth. Back in the day, they used to paint marble, right? And so when you look at the Lincoln Memorial and all these neoclassical designs that always have like that natural marble finish, it's important to remember that these things existed like with paint on them, and it kind of takes away a little bit of like this neoclassicism and this recognition of that. But anyhow, David was a person who liked to blend the Greco-Roman ideals of of past sculptures, sorry, we're thinking in my head, and blend them with biblical themes, right? Now, one of the best examples of this, let's see if I can move this, is I think the Pieta, although David is much more famous. Now, with the Pieta here, it's a famous scene that's often drawn in art, especially religious art, is Mary, Mother Mary, of course, with Jesus after he's been, you know, taken from the cross, and you can see, it's a famous scene because it's an emotional scene. And what we have here with this statue of the Pieta is we have a idealized form of Mary. In fact, instead of making her like older, like how she should be, like Jesus was at 34 or something when he was crucified, instead of making her like a woman that would reflect that age, she's shown as a youthful beauty. And in fact, he modeled Virgin Mary after Athena, right? And how Athena looked in statues. And you can see that she has a very kind of calm look on her eyes and that she's much larger. And that largeness is to emphasize both her importance as a human being, right? The Virgin Mary, and also to emphasize her being a mother to Jesus and to show the anguish that she has to have Jesus, who is transformed from not just a man, but also to her child son by the dimensions of this art, right? And it reflects the connection in the very normal relationship to believe to be had between Mary and Jesus, even though that he was supposed to be the son of God in religion. So, also we have Michelangelo's David, right, which pictures David before Goliath. You've seen the pictures before, but what I wanted to show you right over here is the detail of the veins that's carved into the marble and how much time that must take, because Michelangelo wanted to emphasize and get things right, and he knew that you had to have, if you were going to do an archetype of a human form, you wanted to have those veins, because it's very common for people to have veiny hands and veiny arms, especially if they're young and they don't have a lot of muscle mass, etc. Right? So anyhow, and it shows, of course, the harmony and the grace. And a lot of times, the David statue showed David after he defeated Goliath, and he's showing him before, standing resolute. He's got his weapon draped over his back, like, boy, he about to do it, right? And that's what David is about. So, last but not least, of course, he helped design St. Peter's Cathedral. Sorry, that's things over there. And of course, the Sistine Chapel, right? The ceiling murals. And the reason the St. Peter's Cathedral is important is because that building in Rome was what they used to design the U.S. Capitol building. But the Sistine Chapel, it took over 4 years for Michelangelo to complete, and it shows the biblical history of the world from creation to flood, right? That's present in the Bible. You can see there's a diagram here. You can get the PowerPoint from me on the assignment, but it kind of labels where all these different things are going on in the picture, right? And a lot of you guys have seen this, right? The creation of Adam, right? A lot of you guys have seen a lot of these different individual pieces of frames, right? If you've ever seen any sort of art, it's very popular. Now, the last but not least, of course, is Raphael, right? And I have a picture of this in my room, and then I also have a student version somebody did with some of the teachers and staff members and students of CK. So this is called the School of Athens, and of course, it also blends the Christian and classical style here, because this is a painting that was made for a church, right? It was made for the Catholic Church. And it's on one wall, and there's other paintings on this, but this one panel depicts all these different philosophers of Greece and Rome. Now, this is like the Roman style of this cathedral, but it has Greek thinkers. It's called the School of Athens. So there's a little bit of like a blending of things and mixing metaphors here. But you have, of course, Plato, which is pointing up, saying the Platonic idea, perfection comes from the heavens. And then Aristotle's talking about the value of observing the world around you. And interestingly enough, Raphael painted Michelangelo, the guy we just talked about, right here as a Greek philosopher. And of course, Plato he saw as Leonardo da Vinci, who he painted right here as well. And Raphael also painted himself over here, I believe, into the image, because of course he would consider himself to be one of the best people. And then we have some famous different people who are depicted as like, Pythagoras, but also sometimes as some of the most important artists from the time period that he was thinking about, right? Now, I think the most important literary piece from the Renaissance in Italy. Um, there's probably two, but the one that we're going to emphasize is Niccolo Machiavelli, right? And here he wrote this book called The Prince, right, which is actually published after his death, but it was basically a guide for how rulers have to gain and maintain power. And he cut a little bit against the grain of the Renaissance in some ways because it wasn't about perfecting yourself and making yourself a perfect ruler and living up to classical standards, as we see like there is reflected in the art of Raphael or Michelangelo or or Leonardo, right? It was about maintaining power and being a realist, right? At the same time, his friend near this time wrote a book called Utopia, Sir Thomas More, who was in England, about how we could all live in peace and harmony and how things should be done. But that was kind of an ideal work, but Niccolo Machiavelli wrote from a realist perspective. He's like, look, you need to maintain power. War is inevitable. All you need to do is just make sure that you come out on the best, on the top, right? And he also said, you know what? You can't be feared and loved. It's too hard to do. So it'd be better to be feared than loved, right? Because if they fear you, they'll never revolt, right? But if they love you, they can fall out of love with you, et cetera, et cetera. But it's one of the most influential politics writers that have ever lived. Probably he might have created the idea of political science or modern political philosophy. And he famously said that politics have no relation to morals, right? So the idea that it's irrelevant. The only thing that matters is maintaining your power, building your power, and keeping your power. And that really is a reflection of individualism because the prince is the power, the prince is the state. And this kind of idea will have long lasting impacts across Europe, including with like Louis XIV, who said, I am the state, right? And so we'll see this go on for years past the Renaissance. So the last thing, though, I'd like to say is maybe the Renaissance wasn't a thing, right? And here's some arguments as to why it might not be a thing. Well, when does it start? No one was aware that they were going through the Renaissance. It's not like somebody woke up and said, "Hey, I'm in the Renaissance," right? It just, like it's kind of a backward-looking thing that we've applied, and we've applied this narrative to fit. Oh, is it there's a Renaissance here, and then there's the Northern Renaissance, and at the same time there's the Protestant Reformation. At the same time there's this absolutism, and it's like we're just applying these themes and these broad brushes and strokes to tell a narrative about history. But is that narrative necessarily true? Why is it accepted as true? Now, 95% of Europeans likely never experienced any of the benefit of the Renaissance. They didn't experience this. They were, enclosure farmers, or they were peasants that didn't really have any sort of political power, probably couldn't even read. They never really got to see any of this art that was being generated in the city states of Italy or being generated for the rulers in the Northern Renaissance, as we'll come to find out later, right? And it didn't filter down, right? And life expectancy actually went down in most of Europe during the Renaissance. People were still dying of the Black Death. It wasn't like the Black Plague ended and then all of a sudden the Renaissance happened. That's not the way that the world worked, right? Things don't fit in these little boxes, right? Last but not least, borrowed heavily from Muslim empires. There's a belief that Copernicus, the guy that we think of as the most important thinker of the Renaissance / scientific revolution, which are kind of happening at the same time, that his idea of the heliocentric universe, he just stole from a Muslim thinker, right? That there's papers and manuscripts that have the same formulas and things and drawings and that he had and he might have been aware of, so he could have just stole them, right? Plagiarism much? Come on, Copernicus, do better. You're canceled, right? Also, it does not demonstrate a superior of thought or a movement away from religion, really. Like, religion was still important, right? Even when the Protestant Reformation happens, Protestant religions just become more important, right? And even for that, in the places where Catholicism was still strong, it was even strengthened, and it still maintained the life center of a lot of communities was still the Catholic Church at this time. And also, I would argue, this is a separate one, that the Northern Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance have some in common, but they have very little in common, right? Like the Italians painted frescoes with plaster and oil paint and a lot. And some of the Northern Renaissance people used wood carvings, or in the case of Durer, they used watercolors, right? And Durer's young hair, which you guys will see is an image coming up later, is very, very different, right? And Bruegel's scenes of life, of like normal everyday life, are very, very different than the paintings that you see of the Italian Renaissance. So how can you really say that they're just one glorified, unified thing, right? And of course, there's really no wealthy patrons beyond the kings and queens in the north, right? And so you'll see, you'll see what I'm talking about in the next task. But anyhow, I wanted to say thank you for paying attention. And then also, if you like this, please give me $100 million. Thank you, and have a good day. Now I got to turn the dang thing off.